Friday afternoon at the Oak Ridge Private Club. The dining room hummed with the quiet conversations of the town's elite. Arthur Vance sat alone at a corner lakeside table. He wore a faded flannel shirt, waiting for his usual order. Victoria Sterling walked through the oak double doors. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, demanding attention. She stopped at Arthur's table. She announced that the table was hers, gesturing dismissively at his worn clothing. The clinking of silverware stopped. The entire dining room watched in absolute silence as she called him a grease-stained nobody. Arthur did not argue. He did not even look up. He calmly set down his water glass and folded his napkin. "My father is the senator," she reminded the room. "You won't fix another engine in this town." Arthur reached into his jacket. He withdrew an older, encrypted mobile phone, bypassing the touchscreen models everyone else carried. He pressed a single speed dial button. He waited 2 seconds, then spoke 5 words into the receiver, "Open the Sterling Ledger file." He ended the call. He left a $20 bill next to his plate and walked out the door without looking back. Arthur drove back to his restoration shop, a quiet brick building filled with the scent of motor oil and old leather. He put on a heavy work apron. He began polishing a vintage carburetor with exact, methodical strokes. Across town, the story from the dining room reached Senator Sterling's office before the afternoon tea was served. Victoria sat opposite her father's mahogany desk, recounting the insult with theatrical exaggeration. Senator Richard Sterling, an imposing silver-haired man in a tailored suit, steepled his fingers and listened carefully. He did not tolerate men who refused to bow. He picked up his office phone and dialed a private extension. He requested the town's planning director to pull every permit and business license associated with Arthur's shop. By mid-afternoon, a clerk at the municipal building was already stacking thick manila folders on a desk. A minor commercial variance, granted 3 years ago, was immediately flagged for revocation. Back at the shop, Arthur wiped the grease from his hands. He looked toward the window, waiting for the inevitable knock. The following morning, 2 municipal inspectors in gray suits walked into the quiet restoration shop. They handed Arthur a clipboard detailing 3 sudden building code violations, demanding an immediate halt to operations. Arthur did not argue or raise his voice. He took a pen and signed the revocation notice with a steady hand. The inspectors left, looking faintly embarrassed. Arthur walked to the front window and flipped the sign to "Closed." Evening fell over Oak Ridge. A heavy, cold rain began to wash over the cobblestone streets outside the shop. Arthur sat alone in the dark workshop. The only light came from a single brass lamp over his workbench. The sound of the rain was broken by a sharp, deliberate knock at the heavy wooden front door. Arthur opened the door. Evelyn Cross stood there under a black umbrella, the rain slicking her golden blonde hair. She stepped inside without an invitation, carrying a thick, sealed manila folder under her trench coat. She placed the heavy file on his workbench. "I know who you were," she said quietly, holding his gaze. Arthur looked down at the folder, then back at Evelyn, his handsome face remaining completely unreadable. Evelyn untied the string of the folder, spreading out sheets of complex financial data under the warm lamplight. She pointed at a row of numbers, detailing the suspicious ledger anomalies within Victoria's high-end boutique. Inflation of supplier invoices, hidden shell companies registered in a neighboring European jurisdiction, the pattern was clear. Arthur leaned forward, his sharp jawline cutting through the shadows as he examined the records with clinical precision. He ran a grease-stained thumb down the page, recognizing the exact financial signatures he used to track years ago. Evelyn watched him closely, noting that the closure of his shop had not shaken his absolute composure. "The senator believes he has erased your leverage," she said, her voice low and resonant over the sound of rain. Arthur slowly closed the manila file, the heavy paper creasing under his steady, calm hands. He looked out toward the dark, wet street, knowing the mechanism of their subdue had already been set in motion. Morning light broke over the Sterling estate, a sprawling European-style mansion hidden behind tall iron gates. Inside the grand dining room, Senator Sterling sat at the head of a long mahogany table, reading the morning paper. Victoria sipped her espresso, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled. She smiled, confident that the mechanic was no longer a problem. Across town, inside the closed restoration shop, Arthur Vance opened a heavy, encrypted laptop on his workbench. Evelyn handed him a cup of black coffee. They stood side by side, watching lines of data upload through a secure federal gateway. Arthur typed a final command string. He did not hesitate. His keystrokes were as precise as his mechanical work. The screen flashed a confirmation prompt. The ledger anomalies and Shell Company records were now in the hands of the Treasury. Back at the estate, the senator's private phone rang. It was an unscheduled call from his primary offshore wealth manager. Sterling listened as the voice on the other end explained a sudden, unexplained freeze on 3 of his corporate accounts. The senator lowered the phone slowly. He looked out the window toward the town, a cold realization settling over him. The senator's fingers trembled slightly as he dialed his brother, the district attorney. The call went straight to an automated voicemail. Victoria strolled back into the dining room, holding a black credit card. She complained loudly that her morning boutique order had been inexplicably declined. Sterling did not answer her. He walked past his daughter in absolute, pale silence, leaving her standing alone by the mahogany table. Back at the quiet restoration shop, Arthur closed the heavy encrypted laptop. The digital audit was out of his hands now. Evelyn watched as he seamlessly picked up a steel wrench, returning to the vintage engine as if nothing had happened. Monday morning arrived in Oak Ridge. The crisp autumn air hung heavy over the neoclassical pillars of the municipal building. 2 black government SUVs pulled up to the curb outside City Hall, parking precisely in the restricted zones. Federal agents stepped out of the vehicles. They wore dark suits and carried empty cardboard banker boxes toward the entrance. Inside the building, the planning director who had revoked Arthur's permit sat at his desk, staring blankly at a frozen spreadsheet. The office door opened without a knock. An agent placed an empty box on his desk and began unplugging the computer tower. News of the federal audit spread through the hallways of City Hall like wildfire, freezing all daily operations. Clerks and administrative assistants whispered in hushed tones, watching boxes of records being wheeled away on metal carts. Senator Sterling's chief of staff quickly stuffed a heavy folder into a leather briefcase and slipped out through a rear exit. In his private study, Senator Sterling watched a local news broadcast reporting unusual regulatory activity downtown. He poured himself a glass of scotch, his hands shaking slightly as the ice clinked against the heavy crystal. Meanwhile, Victoria Sterling arrived at her high-end boutique, parking her luxury sports car carelessly near the curb. She was shocked to find 3 plainclothes investigators already inside, methodically sorting through her apparel supplier invoices. Victoria stormed into the shop, demanding they leave immediately, her face flushed with defensive and haughty anger. A female investigator calmly presented a signed federal search warrant, completely ignoring her emotional outburst. Victoria's phone buzzed in her hand with an urgent message from her father, but the realization of her vulnerability had already set in. Victoria stood frozen in the center of her boutique as investigators wrapped yellow evidence tape around her filing cabinets. She watched helplessly as her high-end designer inventory logs were systematically entered into federal seizure sheets. At the Sterling mansion, the senator frantically fed confidential ledger sheets into a heavy-duty paper shredder in his study. The machine whirred loudly, then jammed, leaving half-destroyed financial records visible in the sharp teeth of the blades. He abandoned the machine, staring out the window with sweat dripping down his pale, aging face as a siren echoed in the distance. Meanwhile, the storm over Oak Ridge finally passed, leaving the wet streets reflecting the deep orange sunset. Inside the quiet workshop, Arthur Vance carefully wiped down his mechanical tools and placed them back into their precise slots. Evelyn Cross stood near the doorway, her phone screen illuminating her face as she monitored the breaking news alerts. The municipal planning office and the Sterling boutique are completely locked down, she reported quietly into the room. Arthur did not smile. He simply adjusted his work apron, his eyes fixed calmly on the cold, dark town center. Tuesday morning brought a quiet stillness to Oak Ridge, the early fog wrapping around the brick exterior of Vance Restoration. Inside, Arthur Vance poured hot water into a simple ceramic teapot, the steam rising into the cool, dim air of the workshop. Evelyn Cross arrived without a sound, setting her leather briefcase on the wooden table and opening a secure tablet. The screen displayed live footage of Victoria Sterling dodging aggressive reporters outside her upscale residential building. Local news anchors confirmed that Senator Sterling had officially retreated to his private country estate, refusing all public interviews. Evelyn looked up from the glowing screen, asking Arthur if he was prepared for the inevitable federal subpoena.
Everything is proceeding as planned.
Arthur did not answer immediately. He walked over to a loose brick near the base of the old workshop chimney. With a calm, practiced motion, he pulled the brick free, revealing a small, velvet-lined hidden compartment. He withdrew a leather case and placed it on the table, flipping it open to reveal his old federal investigator badge. Evelyn stared at the polished silver emblem, realizing the full, dangerous depth of the man she had aligned with. Evelyn looked from the polished badge back to Arthur, her voice low as she asked why he had left the department. Arthur stared down at his hands, the memory of his final, exhausting investigation weighing heavily on his mind. He explained that when the compromised system protected the guilty, he chose the quiet clarity of restoring old engines instead. The Sterling ledger connects directly to the names that forced you out, Evelyn noted, her eyes burning with resolve.
And now we know why.
Far away at his secluded country estate, Senator Sterling paced his dark patio, shouting furiously into his phone. His high-priced defense attorneys delivered the grim reality: the federal warrant was absolute and completely unblockable. In the mansion's living room, Victoria sat alone in the dark, watching her luxury lifestyle dissolve into a legal nightmare. Back in the workshop, Arthur slowly placed the leather case containing his badge back into the wall cavity. He slid the old brick back into position, sealing his former identity away with a heavy, deliberate click. He looked at Evelyn, his handsome face hardening as he stated they had less than 48 hours to finalize the grand jury file. By Wednesday morning, the workshop table was covered in cross-referenced banking ledgers and corporate filings. Evelyn highlighted a series of wire transfers that connected Senator Sterling directly to the offshore shell companies. Arthur studied the encrypted codes, utilizing a specialized tracking methodology from his time at the Treasury. He calmly wrote a single, high-level political name on a yellow notepad, completing the final link in the chain. A local radio broadcast in the background announced that a federal grand jury panel had been officially convened. At his country estate, Senator Sterling reviewed the leaked list of potential witnesses for the upcoming inquiry. His eyes stopped on the name Arthur Vance, his expression shifting from anger to absolute, paralyzing terror. He realized the quiet mechanic his daughter had insulted was the operative who had dismantled his former associates. Back in Oak Ridge, Evelyn securely locked the completed financial dossier into her heavy leather briefcase. Arthur stood by the glass doors as evening fell, watching the final hours tick away before the formal presentation. Thursday morning arrived with a cold light striking the marble steps of the Western District Federal Courthouse. Evelyn Cross marched toward the main entrance, tightly gripping the leather briefcase containing the finalized financial dossier. Dressed in a sharp charcoal suit with her blonde hair pinned back, her expression reflected absolute professional resolve. Across the street, Arthur Vance sat silently in the cabin of his old pickup truck, observing the courthouse facade. An unmarked black sedan stopped at the rear entrance. Two plainclothes investigators escorted Victoria Sterling inside. Victoria wore oversized sunglasses to hide her pale face, walking quickly to avoid any lingering attention. Inside the grand jury waiting room, Senator Sterling sat with his head bowed while three defense attorneys whispered frantically. The heavy door opened. The lead federal prosecutor walked in, carrying the highly classified dossier Arthur had prepared. Without a word of greeting, the prosecutor dropped the thick file directly onto the table in front of the senator. Sterling's eyes locked onto the front page, a red Department of Treasury security seal signaling the end of an empire. Senator Sterling's lead defense attorney frantically adjusted his glasses, flipping through the financial documents with a pale, trembling face. He leaned close to whisper in the senator's ear, slowly shaking his head in helpless admission of total defeat. Senator Sterling gasped for air, his aging hands gripping the armrests of the mahogany chair to anchor his fading authority. Giving them no time to recover, the prosecutor presented a second document, a formal subpoena to testify before the grand jury. In the adjacent interrogation room, Victoria Sterling sat across from two federal agents, sobbing as she shakily removed her sunglasses. The agents coldly slid a prepared deposition regarding the obscure shell companies toward her, demanding her authorizing signature. Meanwhile, Evelyn Cross stood in the courthouse corridor, quietly observing the intense proceedings through a frosted glass panel. She slowly raised her phone, her thumb sliding quickly to send a brief, decisive message to Arthur Vance. Outside the courthouse, Arthur looked at his phone screen in the dim cabin of his old truck. The text read, "Leverage activated." Arthur Vance started the engine, the low rumble of the motor accompanying his slow departure as the wheels of justice began to turn. At exactly 1 p.m., the heavy mahogany doors of the federal grand jury courtroom officially opened. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was stifling, the gallery packed tightly with local journalists. Senator Richard Sterling entered from a side door, his face appearing 10 years older under the white LED lights. He tried to maintain his usual commanding presence, stepping up to the witness stand and placing a trembling hand on the Constitution. At the prosecution table, Evelyn Cross sat in the advisory row, calmly opening a file labeled with a security clearance. The federal judge entered wearing a robe of authority, and the entire courtroom immediately fell into absolute silence. The lead prosecutor stood up, requiring no reference notes, and began reciting the list of 17 financial violations. Every inflated number from Victoria's high-end boutique was read clearly, echoing off the 4 stone walls. In the very last row against the stone wall, Arthur Vance appeared in his old dark wool coat, the collar turned up. Arthur's piercing eyes locked onto Sterling's trembling back. A silent, devastating judgment had been finalized. The prosecutor presented the grand jury with the final piece of evidence, a sworn deposition bearing Victoria Sterling's authorized signature. Seeing the signature, the defense attorneys quietly snapped their briefcases shut, officially abandoning their high-profile client. Sterling attempted to speak, but his throat seized. The sharp crack of the judge's gavel officially closed the hearing. 2 federal marshals approached the witness stand, escorting the once powerful senator out of the silent courtroom. As the heavy doors opened, blinding camera flashes flooded the hallway, capturing the historic moment of his absolute downfall. At the prosecution table, Evelyn Cross calmly folded her classified folder. A perfect legal victory required no loud celebration. From the darkest back row, Arthur Vance slowly stood up, adjusted his heavy wool collar, and turned away. He exited through a secluded side door, stepping out into the cold, sharp air of the fading afternoon. Across Oakridge, every television screen simultaneously broadcast the immediate, total asset freeze of the Sterling family estate. Arthur drove his old pickup truck back to the quiet workshop. Arrogance had been punished, and order was restored. In the days that followed, Oakridge began to change its appearance. The once intimidating Sterling mansions gradually became empty and abandoned. Inside the municipal administrative offices, newly appointed staff began replacing the old faces who had been permanently suspended. A comprehensive urban planning review was immediately initiated, firmly crossing out the irregular projects approved under the Sterling administration. Evelyn Cross was invited to serve as the senior legal advisor for the town council, returning to the light. She politely declined any public praise, focusing her sharp intellect solely on restoring transparency to municipal contracts. Arthur Vance maintained his quiet routine. His restoration shop opened its doors to local customers just like any other weekday. He focused entirely on restoring a vintage engine for a local resident, paying absolutely no attention to the town's gossip. One afternoon, Evelyn visited the workshop. She carried no classified files this time, only 2 warm cups of coffee. They sat together on an old wooden bench inside the garage, replacing the exposure of secrets with the quiet peace of shared silence. The storm of power had passed over Oakridge, leaving an extraordinary calm for those who had bravely confronted the darkness. The physical erasure of the Sterling legacy began with the town street signs. Workers unbolted the heavy metal plates bearing the senator's name. At the luxury boutique, the gold leaf lettering was methodically scraped away from the glass, removing the last traces of Victoria's unearned arrogance. Federal liquidators emptied the grand estate, carrying away generations of hoarded wealth and classical art to cover the municipal restitution. Inside City Hall, Evelyn Cross authorized the reallocation of the recovered funds, directing the capital back into transparent public infrastructure. She operated entirely in the open, replacing closed-door negotiations with a legal standard of absolute accountability. Back at the workshop, Arthur Vance placed the final chrome component onto the restored vintage vehicle, locking it into perfect alignment. He wiped his hands with a clean cloth, his stoic face reflecting the quiet satisfaction of a job flawlessly completed. As evening approached, Arthur turned off the harsh industrial lights and locked the heavy wooden doors of his garage. He walked down the cobblestone street alongside Evelyn, their partnership bound not by words, but by a shared moral architecture. Oakridge breathed again, standing resilient and bright, a town that had survived the dark mechanisms of corrupted power. Far from the town center, Victoria Sterling sat in a small, sparsely furnished rented apartment. Her designer wardrobe had been entirely liquidated. She stared blankly at a pile of rejected credit applications, the heavy silence of her new reality finally settling in. Miles away at the restricted country estate, Richard Sterling sat on a wooden porch, his silver hair unkempt and his tailored suits gone. He held a single sheet of paper bearing his finalized federal sentencing date, his hands shaking in the cold autumn wind. Back in the heart of Oakridge, the once exclusive private club was under new management, its doors now open to the public. Inside City Hall, Evelyn Cross stood at the head of the council table, reviewing public infrastructure bids with absolute precision. Her presence commanded respect through clarity and fairness, replacing the old shadows of coercion with a bright, undeniable transparency. Down the street, the freshly painted sign of Vance Restoration caught the golden afternoon sunlight, standing as a quiet pillar of the community. Arthur wiped a clean cloth over the gleaming hood of a finished classic car, his sharp jawline relaxed in the peaceful atmosphere. He looked out at the bustling, honest town, knowing the mechanism of justice he had set in motion was fully complete. The federal sentencing hearing for Richard Sterling was scheduled for a cold Tuesday morning in the federal district courthouse. Sterling sat in a holding cell, his once impeccable charcoal suit now wrinkled and hanging loosely on his frame. Across the city, Victoria Sterling moved through the quiet, sterile halls of a social services agency, seeking temporary assistance. She stared blankly at a pile of rejected credit applications, the heavy silence of her new reality finally settling in. Back in the heart of Oak Ridge, Arthur Vance stood in his workshop, watching the morning news on a small, grainy television while he cleaned his tools. The reporter confirmed that the Sterling family's remaining assets had been transferred to the Municipal Restitution Fund. He turned off the television, satisfied that the cycle of influence and corruption had reached its natural, legal conclusion. Evelyn Cross entered the workshop, her expression serene and devoid of the weight that had carried the last few months. They walked outside together into the crisp, clean morning air of a town that no longer lived in fear of the Sterling name. The restoration of Oak Ridge was complete, the broken mechanisms of the town had been repaired, piece by precise piece. Months passed, and the wounds Sterling left on the town had finally begun to knit together under new, honest leadership. A new public park was inaugurated on the former site of the Sterling mansion, with families playing under clear, bright skies. The municipal budget reports were posted publicly every month, showing a surplus and renewed investment in local schools and hospitals. Evelyn Cross walked through the busy town square, greeting residents who now viewed the council with trust instead of fear. Arthur Vance watched the community from his workshop doorway, noting the steady flow of customers who valued quality over status. He was no longer just the silent observer, he had become a quiet, respected fixture of the community he helped save. The restored vintage car he had worked on for weeks was finally completed, reflecting the sun like a polished mirror. A local resident arrived to collect the vehicle, shaking Arthur's hand with genuine gratitude and mutual respect. Arthur watched the car pull away, its engine humming a smooth, perfect rhythm that echoed the restored order of the town. The cycle of corruption had been effectively neutralized, leaving behind a foundation of accountability that would last for generations. The city council chamber stood quiet, its massive doors finally closed on the final audit of the previous administration. Evelyn Cross archived the last file of the Sterling redevelopment project, officially archiving the corruption case for the federal records. She took a moment to look out the window at the town square, watching a group of children playing in the park. A sense of professional completion washed over her, the burden of the town's secrets having been successfully lifted and addressed. At the workshop, Arthur Vance finished the final calibration on the last restoration project assigned before the town's transition. He stood before the tools that had been his only companions during the months of tactical observation and silent work. A letter arrived by post, a formal recognition from the federal department, thanking him for his discreet, high-level cooperation. Arthur read the letter once, then meticulously fed it into his stove, letting the flames consume the evidence of his past. He stepped out of the workshop one last time, locking the door firmly to mark the conclusion of his temporary mission. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a long, steady glow over a town that now stood entirely on its own. A new season arrived in Oak Ridge, with winter's first frost coating the cobblestone streets in a delicate, white layer. The town square remained active, now a hub of genuine community connection rather than a display of political power. At the town council, Evelyn Cross finalized the long-term transparency charter, ensuring the errors of the past would never be repeated. She glanced at the framed city charter, her hand resting briefly on the document as a symbol of restored civic duty. Outside, the air was crisp, and the distant sound of church bells signaled a quiet, midday pause for the working residents. In the workshop, Arthur Vance replaced a set of worn gaskets on a neighbor's car, his movements practiced and efficient. He had moved past the shadows of his former life, finding a profound sense of purpose in the honest craft of his hands. A young local apprentice entered the shop, seeking guidance on a technical repair, marking the beginning of a new mentorship.
Yes, exactly right.
Arthur stepped back, allowing the younger man to take the lead, passing on the skills that were the foundation of his trade. The workshop door remained open to the light, a symbol that Oakridge had successfully moved beyond its darkest chapter. The winter snow began to fall over Oakridge, blanketing the town in a pristine, quiet layer of white. Inside his shop, Arthur stood by the front window, watching the flakes settle on the newly paved streets. He felt a profound release, as if the cold weather was finalizing the cleansing of the town's difficult history. Evelyn arrived, shaking the snow from her coat, the sight of her familiar face bringing a warmth that the season could not chill. They did not speak of the trials or the files, focusing instead on the simple comfort of their shared, honest presence. The town of Oakridge moved forward, defined not by the names of the powerful, but by the integrity of those who remained. In the distant country estate, the last of the Sterling legacy faded away, unmourned and soon forgotten by the changing town. Arthur picked up his heavy coat, ready to close the shop for the evening, feeling the weight of his mission fully lifted. As they stepped out into the winter night, the town square was lit by the soft, steady glow of street lamps, standing strong and secure. The legacy left behind was not one of names, but of a balanced, fair community, silently thriving under the light of justice.